So science in the 1400s and the 1500s, that is the Renaissance and the Reformation, is going to go through a dramatic change. For one thing, scholars in Europe will learn Greek. And they hadn't known Greek for 1,000 years. Greek just disappeared from Europe. And since access to Greek was absolutely essential to make any kind of progress in science, you needed to be able to read the Greeks, Aristotle, Plato. You certainly needed to read Aristotle so you could read some of his very basic books. You need to learn Greek. And that's going to happen starting in the year 1400 in Florence, thanks to the great Renaissance figures in Florence who accent the need to learn Greek. So they begin to learn Greek in Florence. Soon that will be everywhere. Then into the 1500s, Spain, France, England will all have scholars who will go to schools and learn Greek and then study the ancient scientists in Greek. So that is a dramatic increase in the amount of scientific information that floods into the great European capitals, Paris, London, and other places in the 1400s and the 1500s. And so by the year 1600, all the nations of Europe have a powerful, strong control of ancient learning, which they need, but now the great leap is going to take place in the 1600s. So what are the periods of Renaissance and Reformation? Well, roughly, if you want to make it expansive, you could say 1400 to 1600. That's the usual dates of Renaissance and Reformation, and we all know that Petrarch is sort of the beginning. In the late 1300s, Petrarch is already going into libraries and retrieving books from the ancient world, Latin and Greek. So that's the beginning of the Renaissance. He's in the library in Verona. He finds the letters of Cicero. And then around 1400, Greek comes to Florence. You all know the whole story. If you don't remember it, go back and look at the Renaissance lecture in this series. And we know by 1400, they're bringing Greek manuscripts from Constantinople to Florence. All comes to Florence first, and then it will go around the whole world. And by 1500, in the age of Leonardo, with the Renaissance complete after 100 years, they now print all of Plato and Aristotle in Greek. So for me, that's the key date of the Renaissance in terms of science and the scientific tradition. 1500, it's actually 1501 or 2 or 3, something like that. Circa 1500, in Venice, they print all of Plato and Aristotle in Greek. So that's the day at which the whole Greek tradition is recaptured and available to students in Europe, printed in Greek and Latin both. So if you're at the University of Cambridge, you can read Plato and Aristotle in printed editions coming from Italy. They're coming from Venice or Florence or Rome. And then, of course, as a figure at the peak would be Leonardo. These drawings, scientific drawings of all these different fields in which he was active: astronomy, mathematics, aeronautics, ballistics, every single field. Here he is, the Vitruvian Man drawing. That's a self-portrait over there on the left. This is his scientific friend, Pacioli, from Arezzo. And his medical drawings, you see, at this point, he not only is doing dissections, he's doing drawings of the dissections, and of bones, hands, arms, flying machines, cannon, and all of the rest of it. Now, the other part of the Renaissance and Reformation is printing. And, of course, printing is key to the early modern science, and therefore we need to stop just for a second. Notice Gutenberg, 1450, German, Rhineland, will invent movable type. It will invent the printing press, and then with the spread of printing, and so it will be in all these cities in those dates: Strasbourg 1440, Florence 1471, Lyon 1473, Geneva 1478, London 1480, Antwerp, Stockholm. By 1500 there are 200 printing presses in Germany. By the time of Luther, there are 200 printing presses in Germany. In 1518, 150 different books are published in German. Now that's 1 year after Luther. That's pretty amazing that already the vernacular, the German language, can produce that many books. Then October 31st, 1517. So here's the Reformation side of science. What does the Reformation do to help science? Well, Luther, 1517, 95 Theses, his action is going to cause an explosion of freedom of speech, freedom of print, and freedom of one's religious conscience. So for the next 100 years, that is, for the 100 years before the birth of modern science, which is 1600, so for the 100 years before, in different countries, in different issues, the issue of freedom of speech, freedom of print, will be fought out, and victory will go to the freedom fighters. And that's all due to the Reformation and the values of the Reformation. The victories will all be in Reformation states, not in Roman Catholic states, but in the Reformation states, like England and the Netherlands. So Luther puts up the 95 Theses, he confronts the emperor at the Diet of Worms, and then he has to go into hiding. And what does he do during his time away in the Wartburg Palace? He translates the Bible into German. And by doing that, he's going to begin a whole tradition in the Reformation to translate the Bible so that people can read the Bible themselves. That requires freedom of speech, that requires a freedom of print, and that requires a freedom of religious conscience. And one of the key points in the Reformation is to enable people to read the Bible themselves, and therefore the Reformation feeds education, and education feeds science. So there's another way in which the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, particularly in the states that will fight out political freedom, Netherlands and England, will result in a massive increase of education to all classes. So, just for example, by 1600, the majority of members of Parliament in England are university graduates, whereas only 100 years before, very few were. Or, look at the churches. By 1600, overwhelming majority, 80% of priests in England are university graduates. 100 years before, almost none were. So there you go. There's the story. Reformation, reading, Bible, importance of individual reading, therefore education. You need education, and you get it. The Reformation states invest massively in education. German states, Dutch states, English states, all of them invest in education. Part of it are the great heroes of biblical translation. William Tyndale is going to be arrested and burned up because he dares to translate the Bible into English. His Bible is really the beginning of English Bibles. It'll be the one that's going to be used again and again and again. He's burned to death in 1536. And what he tells you is power of printing, power of reading the Bible. Even if a government tries to stop you, they're not going to be able to stop you. And so it triumphs. The power of printing in Europe tells states you can't shut this off. Now, let's just switch to Islam for a second. In 1515, what does the authority in Turkey, the Sultan in Istanbul, what does he say about printing? Well, he prohibits it. 1515, roughly the same time as the Reformation, very close to the time when Venice is printing all of Aristotle and Plato in Greek, printing in Greek. The highest Islamic authority in all of Islam prohibits the printing press. Anyone found using a printing press will be executed. Now, just stop and think about that for just a second. No printing, which will hold almost to 1900. So, in other words, the Islamic nations led by Istanbul, Turkey, Islamic Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, all will have prohibitions against printing that will last way into the 19th century. So, in other words, everything we talk about for the rest of tonight, when we turn to modern science, is absent from Islamic countries. For this reason, no printing. No printing. Or another example, there's an observatory in Istanbul. It's the greatest observatory in the world. And in 1574, the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul asks the head of the observatory to improve it, and then he asks his interpretation of a comet. Taki accepts the invitation, and so he predicts from the comet that there'll be triumphs for the Turkish forces. The Islamic authorities intervene, the religious authorities, and force the Sultan to close down the observatory, and so in 1580 it was all torn down, and it's not till the 20th century that Turkish science restarts. So there you have it. Renaissance and Reformation, what does it do? Renaissance advances it because of its studies and its trips to Constantinople to learn Greek and bringing all the books, and Reformation advances it because, more than any other thing, education.